Jace woke up in darkness with cold metal under his back and heavy chains wrapped around his wrists and ankles, and something smelled like blood and oil and rotting meat. And he could not remember how he got there, and his head hurt like someone had dropped a rock on it. And he tried to sit up, but the chains pulled him down, and his body felt weak like he had been drugged, and his mouth was dry like sand, and his eyes slowly adjusted to the dark space around him, and he saw he was not alone there. Were cages all around him, and strange shapes moved inside them, and soft breathing and soft crying came from different corners, and some creatures were quiet and still, and others were shaking and moaning, and Jace could tell this was not a prison, but something worse, and his instincts screamed that something terrible was going on here. And then he saw Hershey was in the cage next to him with her knees pulled to her chest, and her skin was pale gray like stone with deep lines on her arms and back where chains had rubbed her raw, and her eyes were large and glowing faintly green, and her face was thin like she had not eaten in days, and her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her hands trembled as she held the bars of her cage, and she looked at Jace without blinking. "You are human," she whispered with a voice so soft he barely heard it over the hum of the ship and the sound of rattling chains, and Jace stared at her unsure what to say, or if he should even answer, and her hands tightened around the bars, and her voice came again, low and broken and full of fear. "They sold me for meat," she said, like she had said those words before, like she had already accepted what they meant, and her eyes were wide, but empty, like hope had already died inside her, and she leaned closer until her face was right at the bars between them, and her voice dropped into a whisper that was sharp like glass. "Please," she said, "just use me to escape. I do not care what you do, just get me out of here." Jace felt a chill go through him, colder than the metal floor and colder than the air inside the cargo hold. And he had seen many things in his life, but never had he seen someone so desperate that they offered themselves like that, not to survive, but just to run, just to not die, screaming and eaten like food. And his mind tried to make sense of what she meant, but his heart already knew. The girl's eyes flicked toward the far corner of the room, where a heavy door stood closed with red lights above it, and a loud click echoed every few minutes, and heavy footsteps passed behind the door, and each time they did, the girl flinched like she had been hit, and Jace realized the guards were checking the cages and counting the prisoners, and maybe more. "Then that, what is this place?" he asked, trying to move closer to her, but the chains held him in place, and she didn't answer right away, and instead reached under her thin cloth and pulled out a small sharp bone that had been hidden near her ribs, and blood dripped from where she had kept it, and Jace realized she had cut into herself just to hide that piece of bone. "They feed us nothing," she said, "and they only give water to keep the meat soft, and they do not talk to us or tell us when it is our turn, but we know because we hear the screams, and we see the blood on the floor, and when they take someone, that cage stays empty and silent forever." Jace gritted his teeth and felt something hot rise in his chest, something between anger and disgust and fear, and he looked around again at the other cages and saw that some were empty and others had broken chains and blood on the floors, and the smell of rot was stronger there. And now he understood why the place felt so wrong. This was not a jail, and this was not a slave ship, and this was not a refugee center or a pirate hold or any of the 100 things he had seen before in the outer systems. This was something worse. This was a meat farm, and they were not prisoners, they were livestock. He looked back at the girl, and she was watching him closely with tired but sharp eyes, and she held the bone between her fingers like it was a key or a weapon or both, and Jace slowly reached for his wrist chains and nodded toward her. "Can you help?" he asked, and her hands moved fast and steady like she had done this before, and the sharp bone slipped into the lock and twisted, and Jace felt a soft click, and one of his wrists came free, and the cold air stung his skin where the cuff had been, and he flexed his fingers to bring feeling back. "Why me?" he asked, still whispering, because the guards might hear them, or worse, and the girl paused for just a moment before answering, and her voice was quiet but clear. "Because you are human," she said, "and your kind always finds a way to survive, even when it hurts, even when others cannot. And I have seen humans break metal and kill monsters and run through fire just to breathe free, and if anyone can get out of here, it is you, and I do not care if you use me or leave me behind or lie to me. Just please, just get me out." Her words struck deep inside Jace, and he looked down at his hands and then back at the cage around him, and something in his mind clicked into place, and he remembered how he had ended up here. He had been on a smuggler run, moving tech to the wrong moon, and a Reggery patrol had jumped his ship and knocked him out, and he woke up in chains. The Reggery were known for cruelty, but he never thought they would sink this low, and he never thought they would trade in meat that could talk and cry and bleed and whisper, "Please, just use me to escape." He reached for his other wrist, and the girl handed him the bone, and he worked on the lock, and it was slower than before because his hands still shook and his heart pounded in his chest like a drum. But finally the second cuff came off, and he was free, and he looked at the girl, and she just stared back, waiting. The ship rocked gently, as if it was in motion, and the air felt thick with heat and fear, and somewhere behind the door the footsteps came again, louder this time, heavier, like something big was coming closer. Jace knew they did not have much time, and he crawled to the edge of his cage and reached out between the bars and touched the girl's hand, and her fingers curled around his like she had been waiting for that signal her whole life. "Hey," he said, "I will help you, but we need a plan." And together they listened to the footsteps and the screams far away and the sound of chains rattling in the dark, and they waited for the moment. The blood on her arms had dried, but the pain was still there, and when she looked at Jace, she saw more than just another prisoner, because she had studied humans in old stories and knew they were not like the others, and something inside her told her he was not going to just lie down and die like most did. In the silence between the alarms and the growling engines, Kari leaned her head against the cold bars and spoke with a voice that no longer held fear, but something else, something flat and hollow like the inside of a dead shell. "My name is Kari," she said, "though names mean little here, and I do not know how long I have been inside this ship, and the lights never change, and the air always smells like blood and rust, and sometimes I wonder if time even moves at all in this place." Jace listened carefully as he rubbed his sore wrists where the chains had been, and he shifted his body closer to her cage, his ears tuned to every soft sound in the dark, and the way her words came slowly, like each one hurt to push out. "I was taken during the fourth raid on my colony," she said, "and my people were healers, not fighters, and we lived in the roots of the Kashar trees deep in the mist forests of the Atra moon, and our skin helped us blend into the bark, and we grew food from the soil and never thought of war. And then one night the sky burned." She closed her eyes as if the memory still played like fire across her mind, and her hands trembled again, not from fear, but from something deeper, like her soul itself had been cracked. "They came without sound," she continued, "and the Reggery do not roar or shout. They move like shadows with weapons that hum like whispers, and by the time the alarm stones glowed, it was already too late. And my father was torn apart in front of me, and my sister tried to run, but they shot her in the back and dragged her away screaming." Jace clenched his fists and felt his jaw tighten, and something about the way Kari spoke made it clear she had told this story before, but never to someone who might live long enough to remember it. "They put the survivors in cages like these," she said, "and there were dozens of us at first, and we were told nothing except that we were going to a place called the Processing Spire, and no one knew what that meant. But we learned soon enough." Her voice cracked just a little at that part, and Jace moved closer, pressing his face to the bars so he could hear her better, because something in him said her words were not just memory, they were a warning. "They separated us by body size and muscle tone," she said, "and they weighed us like animals and tagged our arms with numbers. And when the first one was taken, he begged them to tell him where he was going, and they smiled and said the kitchen." Kari's hands gripped the cage, and her nails scratched the metal, and her body shook with quiet rage, and Jace watched her carefully, seeing not just pain, but strength inside her, something sharp that had not died. Even after all she had seen, "I escaped once," she said, "not far, only a few meters, but it was enough to see the truth. And I saw the cold room where they hang the bodies and the hooks that still drip, and the floor covered in red, and I saw what was left of my sister, and I screamed so loud they hit me until I stopped moving." Jace swallowed hard as his stomach turned, and his heart pounded harder, and Kari's voice lowered into something bitter. "They do not just eat us," she said, "they celebrate us. They dress our corpses in spices and oils, and serve us on golden trays to fat nobles who laugh and drink and call it culture, and they make music while we die, and they call it art." Her eyes were locked on Jace now, and she moved her face so close to his that their breath almost touched, and she whispered like a secret meant only for him, "That is why I do not ask for rescue, I ask for escape. I do not dream of freedom, I dream of not being eaten. And if using me helps you live, then I offer everything I am, because if I must die, I want to die as more than food." Jace felt something shift in his chest, a deep pulse of fury and sorrow and determination, and he had seen death before, but never like this, never wrapped in music and profit and theater. And he reached through the bars and placed his hand gently over hers. "We will not die here," he said with fire in his voice, "and not because I am strong or brave, but because I cannot accept a universe that lets this happen, and if we must fight with broken bones and stolen tools, then we will." Kari nodded slowly, and for the first time her lips curled into something that was not quite a smile, but close, and her fingers tightened around his hand like she was holding on to something really half. "A plan," she said, "not perfect, but maybe enough, and I have watched the guards and listened to their steps, and their shift changes are regular every 2 hours, and one of them is lazy and always leaves his comm panel unlocked near the waste tunnel." She pointed toward the back of the cargo bay where a wall panel flickered with dim red light, and wires dangled loose, and the air smelled worse near it like something rotted just beneath the surface. "That panel leads to a maintenance crawl," she said. "And I saw a rat slip through once, and it never came back, so there must be a way out beyond it." Jace nodded, thinking quickly and already forming the next steps in his mind, and they would need a weapon and a distraction and timing and luck, and he asked what else. "She knew the guards fear fire," she said, "and their eyes are weak in bright light, and the overhead panel above your cage sparks sometimes when the engines hum, and if you can pull the wire it may burst and blind them long enough to move." Jace looked up and saw the small crack in the ceiling where faint sparks danced like dying stars, and he filed the detail in his mind, because every tiny advantage might be life or death. What about? He had broken out of chains before, but this time it felt different, heavier, darker, like the walls themselves were watching him. And as Jace sat in the corner of his cage, still holding the sharp bone Kari had given him, he wondered what kind of person he had become and what kind of person he would need to be to make it through what lay ahead. The ship creaked above them with each turn of its massive engines, and the sound made the walls vibrate like a slow heartbeat, and every time the light flickered from the ceiling, Jace saw the faint outline of other cages, other prisoners, other eyes staring in silence, with no hope left behind them. Kari watched him quietly, her arms wrapped around her knees, her head resting against the bars. And her body was still thin and weak, but her eyes had gained something new, something sharp and alive, like a small flame refusing to die. Jace leaned forward and spoke in a low voice, so soft even the shadows could barely hear it. "Tell me what you know about the layout of this place." Kari nodded slowly, her voice steady despite the bruises on her neck and the tremble in her hands. "There are 5 main sections on the lower deck. This is Section 3, where they keep the processed stock, the ones who are ready to be shipped out or slaughtered, depending on the order." Her words burned into his mind, and he hated how calm she sounded, like she had been forced to become a guide through her own nightmare. "The guards rotate every 2 hours. One tall, one short. The tall one wears red armor with burn marks across the chest plate. He's the one who smokes that sour chemical stick and always drops ash in front of your cage. And he's the lazy one." Jace nodded, remembering the faint trail of black dust near the bars and the burnt smell clinging to the air. "There is a service tunnel that runs behind the food storage lockers," Kari continued, "and it leads to the waste chute, which connects to the maintenance shaft. And if we can get into that shaft, we can reach the power room or the escape pods, depending on the direction." Jace listened carefully, each piece forming a picture in his mind, a map of survival painted with fear and blood. "What do you want from me, really?" he asked, leaning closer, "because no one helps a stranger just to die." A little slower, Kari looked up, her expression calm, but her eyes were wet like storm clouds waiting to burst. "I want you to promise me something," she said, "not freedom, not revenge, just a promise." Jace raised an eyebrow, waiting. "If I die on the way out, do not leave my body here," she whispered. "Not in this place, not on this ship, not in their kitchen." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Jace felt something twist inside him, something painful, something real. He reached through the bars and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "I swear it," he said. Kari nodded slowly, her breath shaking as she let out a long, quiet sigh. "Then we have a deal," she said, "and now we move." She handed him the bone shard again and pointed to the floor where the panel near her feet had a rusted edge and faint scrape marks from where she had tried to lift it before. They worked together silently, Kari loosening the bolts with a broken nail while Jace wedged the bone beneath the corner and pried slowly, careful not to make a sound. And every few seconds they paused, listening for footsteps or voices or the hum of machinery drawing closer. After what felt like hours, the panel finally popped loose with a soft click, and a burst of warm, foul-smelling air rushed out from beneath it, and Jace gagged at the stench, but forced himself to crawl down into the tight, dark space. Kari followed, sliding behind him, and they found themselves in a narrow maintenance duct, barely wide enough for one person, and the walls were covered in slime and mold, and something that squished under their elbows as they crawled. The air was thick and hot, and the metal scraped their skin with every movement, and Jace felt his muscles ache. But he pushed forward, driven by the memory of Kari's words and the promise he had made. They reached a junction where the path split, and Kari tapped twice on the left wall. "That way leads to the power junction, but it's too risky for now," she whispered, "and too many guards near the core. We go right toward the waist chute. It's tight and disgusting, but safer." Jace nodded and turned right, crawling deeper into the darkness, and every breath burned his throat, and every sound echoed louder than it should have, and behind him Kari moved like a shadow, quiet and steady. Then they heard it, the sharp bark of a voice and the thud of boots on metal, and Jace froze, pressing himself against the wall as the sound passed overhead. A hatch opened somewhere above them, and a shaft of light pierced the tunnel, and Kari held her breath as dust floated in the beam like tiny stars, and Jace reached back, grabbing her hand to keep her still. After a few seconds, the hatch closed, and the light vanished, and the sound faded into silence again. They kept moving, and soon the tunnel opened into a round chamber where the walls dripped with filth, and a large vent cover hung loose from one side. "This is it," Kari whispered, "and we have to drop 6 meters to the bottom, then slide into the access hall just beyond the filtration chamber." Jace looked down and saw a slick pipe coated with thick green slime, and it led to a narrow hole with red blinking lights above it. He turned to Kari and saw her shivering, not from cold, but exhaustion. Her strength was fading fast, and her eyes were heavy. "You go first," he said. "I'll catch you if you slip." Kari hesitated, then nodded and lowered herself into the pipe, sliding slowly with her hands braced against the sides. And when she reached the edge, she took a deep breath and let go. She landed with a wet thud below and groaned in pain, but waved for Jace to follow, and he didn't wait. Slid down the pipe, his body twisting to avoid the sharp edges, and dropped into the chamber, landing beside her with a grunt. The floor was sticky, and the air smelled like chemicals and death, but they were alive, and they were one step closer to freedom. Kari pointed to the wall, where a service panel blinked green, and Jace crawled to it, pulling the cover open and finding a small switch marked "Door Override." He flipped it, and the wall creaked, then slowly parted, revealing a narrow hallway lit by flickering blue lights. They slipped through and found themselves behind a row of food crates, each one stamped with strange alien symbols and dates, and Jace didn't want to think about what was inside them. They crawled behind the crates toward a small ladder that led to the upper service deck, and Kari stumbled once, her leg giving out, but Jace caught her and helped her climb. At the top, they found another maintenance door, this one locked, but the panel next to it was damaged and sparking, and Jace ripped off the casing and crossed 2 wires with the bone shard. The door hissed open, and they stepped into a small control room filled with screens and blinking buttons, and a comm panel sat on the desk, still active, with a small light flashing. Jace rushed to it and hit the screen, reading the alien symbols and trying to guess the meaning, and Kari pointed to one word again and again. "That means schedule." There are moments when a person learns the difference between wanting to live and choosing to fight for life. And as Jace and Kari slipped into the shadowed hallway past the control room, with lights flickering above and the floor slick with oil and dust, that was one of those moments, and neither of them spoke because words were too heavy and time too short. And the only thing louder than their footsteps was the pounding in their chests. The air in this part of the ship was different, warmer, heavier, filled with a strange electric smell, and each door they passed hummed with hidden machinery, and behind some, they could hear muffled groans or metal scraping against bone. And Jace knew this was the edge of the processing level where the prisoners were sorted, cleaned, and butchered for transport. Kari moved carefully, her hands brushing the walls for balance, her legs weak from hunger and pain, but her eyes still sharp and searching for signs of danger, and Jace stayed close behind her, ready to grab her or shield her if anything went wrong. And both of them paused when a loud metallic clang echoed through the corridor, followed by a deep growling voice from a speaker above. "Alert processing crew to hallway 9, report immediately. Unauthorized movement detected in section 3." Jace felt a chill crawl down his spine, and Kari gritted her teeth, her body tensing as the sound of boots pounded on metal somewhere nearby, and she pointed to a vent above them, a small hatch barely wide enough for a person up there. She whispered, "Go now." Jace climbed first, gripping the pipe to pull himself up, and then reached down, grabbing Kari's hand as she tried to follow, her body shaking from the effort. And just as she slipped inside The hallway below lit up with the red glow of an emergency light, and a pair of Reggery guards stormed into view, their weapons raised and voices barking orders in their alien tongue. They did not see the hatch close just seconds before, and Jace and Kari held their breath in the dark space above, pressed against each other as the guards passed below and the echo of their voices faded down the hall. "We cannot keep running like this," Jace whispered once the silence returned. "We need to make a move, something loud and fast." And final Kari nodded, wiping sweat from her forehead and pointing forward through the narrow vent. "The escape pods are close, just past the butcher hall. We have to cross through it to reach the launch bay." Jace clenched his jaw and led the way, crawling through the vent as the ship rumbled around them, and the smell of burned fat and blood grew stronger with every meter they moved, and soon they reached the edge of a grated panel that looked down into a massive room filled with smoke hanging from the ceiling like ghosts. Below them were hooks and chains swinging gently in the warm air, and rows of tables stained dark with old blood, and in the center of the room stood a Reggery butcher unlike any Jace had ever seen. It was massive, nearly 7 feet tall, with thick gray skin and mechanical implants running across its arms and shoulders, and in one hand it held a massive cleaver dripping with fresh blood, while the other arm had been replaced with a spinning blade still humming with power. Kari shivered beside him, her voice no more than a breath. "That is the one they call Gracker. He eats the ones who fight back. He says it makes their meat sweeter." Jace felt rage rise in his throat like fire, and his mind screamed for him to act, to run, to fight, to end this nightmare. And he looked around the room searching for a plan, and then he saw it. Near the edge of the hall, just past the butcher's table, was a set of fuel tanks stacked against the wall with warning labels glowing orange, and if he could get to them or cause even one to rupture, the explosion might distract the guards long enough for them to reach the pod bay. But first they had to get down and past Gracker without being seen. And Kari touched Jace's arm, nodding toward the far end of the vent where a maintenance ladder dropped to the floor. He led the way once more, lowering himself slowly until his feet touched the floor silently, and he crouched behind a row of crates filled with frozen meat sealed in translucent bags, and Kari landed beside him a moment later, biting her lip to keep from crying out as her foot twisted on impact. They moved together like ghosts, slipping from shadow to shadow, and Kari pointed to a table where a broken tool lay covered in grease, a long metal spike with sharp edges. Jace grabbed it, tightening his grip and feeling the weight in his hand, and every step he took was careful, measured, silent, until the butcher turned away, heading toward the storage freezer on the far side of the room. "Now," Kari whispered, and they ran. Jace sprinted across the floor, sliding behind the fuel tanks, and Kari followed, breathing hard and clutching her side. And just as they reached cover, Gracker turned with a snarl, sniffing the air and letting out a deep growl. "He knows," Kari whispered. "He can smell us." Jace scanned the tanks and found a loose valve with a warning tag hanging from it, and he didn't hesitate. He grabbed a wrench from the floor nearby and jammed it into the valve, twisting hard until the seal broke and gas hissed into the air, thick and fast and flammable. The butcher roared and charged across the room, his blade arms spinning with deadly speed, and Jace grabbed Kari, throwing her behind the crates just as Gracker's cleaver sliced through the tank and a stream of fuel burst out. Jace lit a spark from the broken control panel beside him and tossed the sparking wire into the stream of fuel just as Gracker lifted his blade again. The room exploded, flames burst through the air like fire spirits dancing through the smoke, and the shockwave threw Jace into the wall, his body slamming against metal, and Kari screamed as the heat roared over her. The butcher howled in rage and pain, his flesh on fire, his implants sparking, and his eyes burning with hate, and he staggered toward them, arms flailing. But Jace rose with the spike in his hand, blood dripping from his head and rage in his heart. He met Gracker head on, driving the spike into the creature's chest with both hands, and the butcher roared again, slashing wildly as fire licked his back and smoke blinded his vision. And Kari crawled to the control panel beside the pod door and slammed her hand on the override switch. The door opened with a hiss, and Jace turned, shoving Gracker back with one last scream of effort and grabbing Kari by the waist. As they tumbled through the door and sealed it behind them, they fell to the floor, breathing hard. The hallway beyond quiet and empty, and behind them the butcher hall burned, the fire growing hotter as the fuel tanks exploded one after another, shaking the ship like a dying beast. Kari pulled herself up, blood on her face and eyes wide with disbelief. "We should be dead," she whispered. Jace looked at her and shook his head slowly, his voice hoarse, but firm. Not yet. They moved down the corridor, now lit only by emergency lights, and reached the escape pod bay, where 4 silver capsules waited with doors open and engines hum. It should have been over, with fire and falling walls and smoke curling through vents like the last breath of a dying beast, but nothing ever ends that easily. And Jace knew at the moment. He looked into Kari's eyes and saw not relief, but fear. Because the fire may have driven Gracker back, but monsters do not burn so easily and butchers do not die without taking someone with them. The hallway behind them shook again as another blast tore through the butcher hall, and bits of the wall cracked and fell, and smoke poured in like liquid shadow, and the lights above them blinked and sputtered, casting the corridor in and out of darkness. And Kari coughed hard, clutching her ribs, her body leaning against the wall as Jace helped her forward toward the lift shaft leading to the cage level. "You do not have to come," she whispered, her voice breaking. But Jace ignored her, lifting her arm over his shoulders and pulling her along, because leaving someone behind felt like losing twice, and this was not just about escape anymore. They reached the shaft, and Jace pried open the service door using the spike still wet with Gracker's black blood, and Kari climbed in first, dragging her legs slowly, while Jace followed, pushing her gently upward with one hand and gripping the wall with the other, and each movement felt like lifting a mountain. The elevator was stuck halfway down between levels, smoke and sparks rising from the broken control panel, and the only path was the narrow crawl space beside it, where old cables and pipes lined the shaft like a metal ribcage. And Jace climbed with Kari close above him, neither daring to speak, as voices echoed from below, guards shouting, calling for backup, screaming about fire and explosion, and something about the beast still moving, still breathing, still looking for the escape. Jace grit his teeth and climbed faster, knowing their time was running thin, and if Gracker survived the fire, then he would not stop until the ship itself fell apart, or until he found Kari and finished what he started. At the top of the shaft, a grated vent led into a hallway near the holding cages, and Jace kicked it open, crawling through and pulling Kari after him, and the moment they dropped into the corridor, the scent of blood and rust slammed into their faces, thick and heavy and all too familiar. The lights were dim and flickering, and the sounds of groaning prisoners filled the space like ghosts moaning in the dark, and Kari stood slowly, her hands shaking and her legs barely holding her up as she walked to the first cage. Inside was a child, small, thin, with violet skin and bright yellow eyes, staring up in silence. And Kari reached through the bars, touching the child's cheek and whispering soft words in her native tongue. And Jace moved to the next cage and saw an old man curled into himself, not speaking, not moving. "The others are broken," Kari said. "They cannot move. They have given up." Jace looked at her and then at the child, and his hand clenched the spike tighter. "We can save one, maybe two, no more, or the pods will be too full, and the guards too fast." Kari nodded slowly, her voice low and hollow. "Then we choose." They broke the locks using the spike and pulled the child out, wrapping her in Kari's cloak and lifting her gently into Jace's arms. And then they turned to the next cage, where a tall man sat watching them with calm eyes and no expression. He stood when they opened the door and said nothing but nodded once before stepping into the hallway, and Jace could see the muscle beneath the scars and knew this one could fight if needed. The group moved fast back through the corridor and up the lift shaft again, this time slower because of the child and Kari's pain and the wounded guard who stumbled into their path at the top. He was small, armored in black with green eyes behind his helmet, and he raised his weapon, but Jace was faster, slamming the spike into his neck and twisting until the body dropped and the gun clattered to the floor. Kari picked up the weapon with shaking hands and handed it to the tall prisoner, who nodded again without speaking and followed behind them as they pushed through the heat and smoke toward the launch bay. Then came the roar. It was not the sound of a man or an animal, but something born of both, something that came from lungs filled with fire and rage and hunger and pain, and it echoed through the halls like thunder made of knives. And Kari stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide and her breath caught in her throat. "He is alive," she whispered, "and he is coming." Jace turned, gripping the spike and scanning the hall behind them, but the smoke was too thick and the lights too dim. And then the ground shook again and metal bent, and from the fire stepped Gracker. His skin was blackened and peeling, his implants sparking and twitching, and his eyes burned red with madness. And he roared again, lifting the spinning blade on his arm and slamming it into the wall as he moved forward. "Run!" Jace shouted, lifting Kari into his arms and grabbing the child tighter. and the group sprinted through the corridor the tall man, turning once to fire at the butcher and then running to catch up as Gracker tore through. The wall behind them, they reached the launch bay, and the escape pods hissed open, their lights blinking and engines humming, and Jace shoved the child and Kari into the nearest pod, then turned to the tall man who stood at the entrance, gun raised. And face set in stone. "You go," Jace said, and the man shook his head. "I hold the door, you launched the pod." Jace wanted to argue, but there was no time, and Gracker was almost there, his roar growing louder and closer, and the metal walls buckling around him. Jace climbed into the pod and hit the sequence, and the door sealed just as Gracker burst through the corridor, ripping apart the floor and charging toward the tall man who stood with the weapon raised, and fired until the flames swallowed them both. The pod launched with a roar and fire surrounded them, and Kari screamed as the ship fell away beneath them, spinning and burning and breaking apart, and the stars stretched into lines as the pod slipped into jump space. Silence followed, only the soft hum of the pod and the quiet sobs of the child, and Kari breathing slow and heavy, and Jace leaning back with blood on his hands and pain in every part of his body. Kari looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You kept your promise." Jace closed his eyes and nodded once for now. The stars outside were quiet, but inside the escape pod the silence was loud and heavy, like a weight pressing down on every breath and every thought. And Jace sat near the back, his hands bloody and eyes staring at nothing, while Kari cradled the child and hummed something soft in her own tongue, like a lullaby from a planet lost long ago. The escape pod was small, barely enough for 3 people, and the walls were scratched and rusted, and the air smelled like burnt plastic and old fuel. And somewhere above the humming of the jump drive, there was a strange clicking noise that reminded Jace of a broken heart beating in metal. He did not know how long they had been drifting through the void, because time had no meaning in jump space, and the stars outside were stretched and blurred like oil on water, and all he could feel was the ache in his arms and the heat from the spike still hanging at his belt. Kari had not spoken much since the launch, only asking once if he thought they made it out before the whole deck went up, and Jace had said yes, even though he did not know, because hope was easier to give than truth, and sometimes the lie helped more than silence. The child had fallen asleep, now her head against Kari's chest, and her small hands curled into fists, and she had not cried once since they pulled her from the cage, just watched with wide yellow eyes and breathed like she was afraid even that would get her noticed again. Jace stood slowly, stretching muscles that screamed with every move, and walked to the pod's console, blinking at the static on the screen and the red warning light that had been flashing since launch, and he tapped a few buttons, but the system was old and most functions were locked or broken, and the NAV beacon was dead. No signal meant no rescue, and no coordinates meant they were flying blind into the void, and all they had left was each other and whatever time the oxygen could buy them. Kari looked up from the child, her eyes tired but alert, and she nodded at the screen. "We are not being followed," she said, and Jace nodded back. "We are not being found either." There was a pause, as if the pod itself was holding its breath. Then Kari whispered, "We need to make a choice." Jace already knew what she meant, and it was not about where to go, but how to end, and whether they wanted to drift forever or take control before the air ran out and the systems failed, and the stars watched in silence as they faded one by one. He walked back to the bench and sat across from her, and they looked at each other not as strangers, but as 2 survivors who had seen the same horror and crawled out of the same fire, and knew that even freedom had a cost too steep for most to carry. "We can try a manual drop," Jace said. "We might fall out of jump space near a trade route or beacon, and someone might find us, or we might rip the pod apart." Kari replied, and scatter across a system no one visits anymore, and the child dies before she wakes again there. Was no good answer, and they both knew it, so they sat there in silence, letting the pod drift and the hum fill the void between their thoughts. Eventually, Kari reached into her cloak and pulled out a small square of fabric wrapped tight with something inside, and she placed it in Jace's hands and nodded. Open it. He unwrapped the cloth and found a small chip barely the size of a fingernail and etched with strange lines glowing faintly blue, and Jace looked up confused. A memory core, Kari said. From my people before the Reggery burned the last vault and sold the survivors for meat. I hid it for years, never thought I would see anyone who could carry it out. Jace turned the chip over in his fingers, watching the light flicker and fade and return again like it had a heartbeat, and he could feel the weight of it not in his hands, but in what it meant. It holds everything, she whispered, not just names and stories, but codes and maps and things they feared we might one day remember. It is worth more than 1,000 lives and more dangerous than a fleet of warships if it falls to the wrong hands. You trust me with this? Jace asked, his voice soft, and Kari looked down at the child sleeping in her arms. You saved me, she said, and her voice broke for a moment, and then she continued, and you gave her a chance to live. That is more than trust, that is faith. Jace looked at the chip again, and then wrapped it back in the cloth and tucked it inside his boot, where no scanner would find it and no hand could steal it. Without blood, we make it out, he said, and I will find someone who can use it right, not for war, but for memory. Kari nodded slowly and leaned back against the wall, her eyes closing for a moment, and Jace let her rest and watched the blinking red light on the console again, wishing it would turn green or blue or even stop blinking. Just for a moment, the pod shook once, soft like something passed near, and Jace sat up, checking the scanner again, but it showed nothing but static. And the clicking above them grew louder for a second before fading again, like whatever haunted the circuits had found a new corner to chew on. Jace knew the silence would not last forever, and something would come for them eventually, be it a patrol, or pirates, or just the cold hunger of space, and he only hoped they would see it coming before the end. Hours passed, or maybe days, and the water ration ran dry, and the child began to stir again, her eyes blinking and her lips cracked and dry. And Jace tore a strip from his sleeve and wet it with what little was left from the wall unit, pressing it gently to her mouth. She drank without speaking, her eyes on his face and her fingers tightening around Kari's arm as if she had seen something in the dark that still followed her here. Then the console beeped once, sharp and sudden, and Jace spun toward it, hope rising like fire in his chest, and the screen flashed a new symbol in green, blinking slow and steady. A ship, he whispered. Someone is near. Kari sat up fast, cradling the child and staring at the screen, and Jace tapped the command to send a burst signal, a simple distress code with no name, no location, no history, just a voice screaming into the stars. The green light blinked faster now, and the hum of the pod grew louder as if something outside had touched it, and then the signal returned clear and strong. Unknown vessel identified, approach vector confirmed, docking in progress. Kari let out a breath and hugged the child close, and Jace stood ready at the hatch, his hand on the spike, just in case the stars had not brought them rescue, but another kind of monster. The pod shook again, and metal arms locked onto the sides, pulling them toward a dark hangar, and the lights above flickered once before turning blue, and for the first time since the cages, Jace felt something like warmth on his skin. The door hissed and opened, and Jace stepped out first, his eyes scanning the room and his hand tight on the spike. But what he saw made him pause. A crew of humans and aliens dressed in black and gray uniforms, standing in silence with weapons lowered and hands open, and at the center a tall woman with silver eyes and a scar across her jaw, who nodded once and said only two words, "You read." The stars outside were calm now, and the air no longer tasted like fear and metal, and Kari stood at the viewport of the sanctuary ship, watching a nebula bloom like a flower across the dark, and her hands trembled not from cold, but from the memory of chains and fire and screams. In the dark beside her, the child leaned forward, pressing her palms against the glass, her breath leaving a fog that faded quickly, and her eyes wide with wonder as she whispered names for stars her people had never seen before. And Kari smiled, though it felt strange on her lips, like something forgotten now returned. Jace was not there anymore, and his absence hung in the air like a shadow with no source, and every corridor she walked reminded her of his voice and his hands, and the way he had refused to run even when escape was in his grasp, and she had begged him to live, and he had simply smiled like a man who already knew his story was meant for fire, not silence. They had buried what was left of him. In orbit above a silent moon, one that no species claimed and no war had touched, and they carved a stone from the ship's spare plating and etched into it words in every language they knew, even those Kari had only seen in dreams. He gave himself. So others could be free. He walked into death, so we could walk into life. He was human, and he was not afraid. The crew of the sanctuary ship were quiet and kind and asked few questions, and when they heard the story, they listened with hands over hearts. And eyes turned to the stars, and some wept, and some lit small lights that floated through the halls for a full day. Without going out, Kari kept the memory core hidden, at first not from fear, but from reverence, because it felt like a piece of Jace's promise. And when she finally gave it to the captain, she did so with trembling fingers and words she barely understood. This is my people's heart. And his final gift, the captain, was an older woman with gray hair and a voice like stone, and she took the chip gently and promised to guard it, and to find those who could unlock its secrets and use them for rebuilding, not for revenge. And Kari believed her, because her eyes were not full of power, but sorrow. Weeks passed, and the child began to laugh again, chasing floating lights through the corridors and drawing stars on the walls with fingers stained from ink. And one day, she asked if Jace would come back, and Kari knelt and held her and said no, but he never really left, and the child seemed to understand in the way children always do when the truth is wrapped in love. One night, Kari sat in the garden dome where alien plants reached toward false suns, and she closed her eyes and whispered the names of every soul lost in the cages and the butcher decks and the holding cells where light never came. And she ended with Jace's name, spoken like a prayer, not of grief, but of thanks. A few days later, the captain summoned her to the bridge, and the screen showed a planet below, one covered in green and blue with cities marked only by dots of light. And she said, this is a human world, not Earth, but one of their colonies, and they are willing to take you and the child in if you wish. Kari felt her chest tighten and her hands shook, and she looked at the child, who was now pressing her face to the glass again and saying, the trees look like our dreams. And Kari knew they could not keep running, and that Jace had not fought for them to drift in orbit forever. They took a shuttle down the next morning, and as the clouds parted, Kari felt something warm on her skin for the first time in years, and she wept not from sadness, but from the feeling of grass under her feet and the laughter of children who had never heard the word meat ship. The humans welcomed them not as refugees, but as guests, and gave them a small house near a field of yellow flowers. And Kari planted seeds she had carried in her cloak and told stories to the young ones who asked about her scars and the language of her people and how the stars looked from a cage. The child went to school with others and learned to write and sing, and sometimes she came home with drawings of a man with a spike and a smile, and she called him the Flame and said he lives in the sky and keeps the bad ships away. And Kari never corrected her. Years passed, and the memory core was unlocked by scholars and dreamers, and they built a vault in orbit to hold what it contained, and they named it the Chainbreaker Archive. And at the center, they placed a statue of Jace holding the spike in one hand and a star map in the other, and every visitor was told his story before they left. Kari became a teacher and then a council member, and she worked with humans and aliens to build laws that stopped the trade and burned the ports that once sold her people. And she never forgot the sound of the cages or the silence of the escape pod or the heat of the Regary's breath in the dark. But what she remembered most was Jace's voice when he said, humans do not run, we fight. And she repeated it in every speech and carved it into stone at every new outpost they built on the bones of fear. One night, long after the last port fell and the last traitor was sentenced, Kari stood alone in the garden of her home, watching the stars shift slowly overhead, and she felt the grass between her toes and the wind on her face, and she whispered into the night, you were right, we are more than fear and more than pain, and you did not die in fire, you became it. And somewhere far beyond the planets, a single light blinked once, as if the stars had heard and answered, and Kari smiled with tears on her face and turned back to her home, where the child, now grown, waited with a new story in her hands. The story was called The Human Who Burned the Chains, and it began not with war or fire or screams, but with a cage and a whisper and the strength to hope again.